Hello, we're back for part 4 of the character customizer little mini devlog series thing I'm doing. This is the third time, believe it or not, that I've recorded part 4. Let me explain briefly. The first time I recorded it, it was very much a continuation of part 3. We stayed in Unreal Engine, added some more camera presets, focusing on various parts of the character's body that the user might want to customize. And I also added a very simple texture to the character. I thought it was fairly safe. Painted out the nipples, things like that. It looked still very much like a mannequin, obviously. But when I was sort of just doing a quick edit of that video, I got a bit worried that YouTube censor bots might hone in on certain parts of the video where the camera was framed at looking at various parts of the character. So I ran it past a few people on my Discord server and ultimately decided I was going to scrap that part and remake it. I'm a tiny YouTube channel. They wouldn't think twice about just deleting my channel, and it's not a risk I wanted to take. My biggest problem with YouTube isn't the fact that they censor this sort of thing. That's fine, it's their channel, they can do what they like. My biggest problem is the uncertainty and the ambiguity around what they will and won't allow. I've seen and can still find worse things on YouTube than what my little part 4 was going to be. But the flip side of that is I've known of people's entire channels getting deleted for probably far less than what my previous part was going to be. So you just don't know, and like I say, a channel as measly as mine, you've got no chance of speaking to an actual human at YouTube and getting them to reconsider. So that's what happened to the first recording of part 4. Then I decided, well, to get around that, we should probably put some clothing on our character. And that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole. And ultimately I found a couple of minor bugs in DTH when I was testing the plan I had. So I wanted to fix those and get a fix out to all the DTH users who might be wanting to follow along before I released part 4. So that was the second time I recorded part 4. During that I discovered some bugs. So hotfix 1.5.4 is now out. I suggest you download it if you are following along, because it will come in handy. So as I said, my plan now is to get some clothing onto our character sooner rather than later. I had obviously always intended to come up with some sort of outfit customization setup. I was intending to do it further along in the series, but I'm going to bring that forward. Now, adding clothing to our character, I'm not an expert. I haven't really tried this before. I tend to just stick to static outfits when I'm transferring characters into Unreal Engine. The easiest way by far would be to do the same, just put an outfit on this character, process it in DTH and go from there. But I figured as we are making a character customizer, I wanted to at least give users the option to mix and match different parts from different outfits. And also want to, try and deal with potential poke through as much as possible, which is, if you're not familiar, that's where the character's body will poke through parts of the clothing. Notoriously difficult to deal with. So we're going to have a look at that as well. I have no idea how this is going to turn out, so don't be following this series with a view to learning best practices or anything like that. It's, as it says in the description, it's very much me fumbling my way through this process and seeing what we can come up with. My only past experience with any sort of clothing customization on characters was, believe it or not, way back in the Skyrim days. I used to mod Skyrim, used to spend a lot of time modding Skyrim. If you go way back to the earlier videos on my YouTube channel, you can see my main Skyrim mod, which was Lakeview Manor Evolution, almost 14 years ago, probably 12, 14 years ago now. But in Skyrim, they obviously have a modular character setup. They had a number of slots. I think there's quite a few actually, 50 all up, 52, something like that. And various bits of clothing / armor would basically occupy various slots on the character. So as a starting point, I think I want to modularize this character to some degree, so separate parts of the body which we can use to replace with various clothing assets. That's my plan at the moment. Now, modularizing characters, I understand, comes with certain challenges in itself. Most notably probably is the chance of visible seams, particularly when more extreme morphs are applied, like our heavy morph here. So that's another thing that A, I don't know how well it's going to work, and B, I'm not sure if we do get seams. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to deal with those yet. But hopefully we will figure all that out as we go. So before we look at cutting up our character, I'm going to jump over to Houdini and just explain a couple of things. Hopefully will make it easier to understand why I'm doing what I'm about to do. Houdini has this thing called the geometry spreadsheet, and in that we can see we have 4 categories. We have points, which is, you probably know this already, is the smallest, I guess, component we can have in 3D space when it comes to geometry. It's a single point in 3D space. We have vertices, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure the distinction between points and vertices. Most DCCs like Max and Maya, I suspect, kind of obscure the point view of things, unless you're dealing with things like particle systems, obviously. But from a geometry point of view, you tend to be sort of working from vertices up, but they are distinct in Houdini. And like I say, there is a document that talks about the difference, but I can't remember it, and it's not important for what we're doing, really. And then we have polygons, which I'm sure you'll know is made up of a minimum of 3 vertices connected together to form a triangle, or more often 4 vertices connected to form a quad. And then finally we have details, which is basically the entire character as a whole. In each of these levels in Houdini you can add what are called attributes. So there can be any type of data stored against any point, for example, or any vertices or any polygon, or at the character level. So if we have a look at points, we can see every point has a position attribute which determines its position in 3D space. We have skin weights and various other attributes, and we also have groups. Groups, well, they're 0 or 1 values. A point either belongs to a group or it doesn't, and if it belongs it'll have 1, if it doesn't it'll have 0. And that same philosophy is repeated for vertices and polygons. And finally, as I say, you can have attributes right at the entire object level. Why am I mentioning all of this? Well, 2 reasons. One is that once you understand that much of Houdini is about manipulating attributes either at the point, vertice, polygon level, then I think it can really help you understand Houdini overall. If I had to single out one thing that made Houdini the, I guess, powerhouse that I think it is its attribute system, and the fact that you can manipulate any attribute at any time. And ultimately, all of these DTH nodes are one way or another manipulating attributes to output an end result. And obviously, being Houdini, it's all non-destructive. The second reason I wanted to talk briefly about attributes and groups is because in the context of DTH, pretty much every time you are required to select anything to do with your character, you will be selecting either based on one or more attributes or from groups. So if I go to the skin node and use this isolate field, these at the top are groups, and we know this because they don't have an at followed by the name of an attribute. So you can see we have a name attribute on this character. We have an FBX material name attribute. Several others. Some of these were imported on the FBX that came out of Daz. Some of them DTH creates along the way and cleans up after itself further on, and they're used sort of internally. So the reason I'm, I guess, talking about all of this is because if I delete this existing skin shape, I have a look at the attributes I currently have to play with. This is basically our blank slate of attributes we can play with. I can only get so granular. So for example, if I wanted to isolate just the hands, so I want to modularize my character, I want the hands to be separate from the arms. At the moment, I have no attribute that will allow me to do that. The closest I can select is just the arms, but that includes the hands. But I don't have an attribute that will allow me to just isolate the hands at the moment. Now, obviously, this is Houdini. We could create the groups we wanted within Houdini by intercepting, for example, the FBX data stream here and slicing it up as we wanted. But I want to keep this tutorial simple. Don't want to go into anything too advanced Houdini wise, and I'm sure somewhere down the track I'm going to add the ability to arbitrarily select groups of polygons to add to shapes. At the moment we are limited to the attributes we have available. You can see the name attribute is the broadest. It's basically a name attribute per figure in Daz. So if we jump back to Daz, we have a Genesis 9 figure, we have the tears, eyes and mouth figures, and they correspond to these. And then we have the material names, which in Daz come from the surface names. So if, for example, I bring up the geometry editor, select our main Genesis 9 character, you can see we have these surfaces on this character, and ultimately they will get exported as FBX materials attributes. So we have these as a result. And like I said, I do want to modularize our character beyond what these current attributes will allow. So I'm going to need to deal with that in Daz before exporting the character. So that was a very long ramble about why I'm about to do this. Apologies for that, but hopefully it was useful for some of you. I'm going to have our character on our heavy morph. It's the most extreme morph we probably have applied at the moment. And the reason for doing that is I want to use it as a template of where to cut, because I want to isolate the pelvis from the legs and the body. At the moment, our body includes the pelvis area, so I want to split the pelvis out. And like I say, I'm expecting to get some seams in Unreal Engine. Not sure how I'm going to deal with them yet, but to minimize that, I think if I can cut at a location where the adjoining faces are at less of an angle, that might help minimize it. So if I cut along there where there's a fairly strong curve, that would be more noticeable as a seam. But I think if I cut along here, for example, just below the navel, it might help minimize it. That's my plan. No idea if it's going to work. Let's find out. So I'm going to start by isolating the pelvis and getting it into its own surface, and ultimately that will give us an attribute that we can use in Houdini to modularize the character with. So I need to find a starting point. Waist isn't what I want. I can use any of these, even though these don't get exported. I can use them to select faces on the character. So I'm going to find pelvis, which is that area. I think that'll be our starting point. So I can click the plus button next to that and that'll add it to a face selection group. And I'm also going to show the legs because I don't want to go below this line. So our legs will start there, our pelvis will end there. So now I just need to select the faces in between. If I hold down Control, I can add to the existing selection. Just grab these faces. I'll now hide the legs just so I can more easily reach these bits. Probably remove the heavy morph for now. So I want to make sure I get all the faces. And then, as I said, I'm going to extend it to just below the navel, so I'm going to follow along this edge loop here. Alright, so with those faces selected, I can right click on surfaces, create surface from selected, call it pelvis. Then in the viewport I can right click, clear selection. Alright, so we have our pelvis surface now. Our body surface is still there, but it's now a little smaller. Next I want to separate the the hands from the arms, so I'm going to start by finding the hands and adding that to a selection set. Now by default that's included the fingernails. I want to keep the fingernails separate because they are a separate material in Unreal Engine, and if I combine them together it would be a lot harder to assign them a separate material through the workflow. So I'm going to find fingernails and hit the minus button to remove them from the selection. I also want to bring this this hand selection a bit higher up the wrist, so I'm going to come to this curvy looking edge loop here up to there. Make sure I get all the faces. Do the same on the other side. Alright, just one check to make sure I selected everything. Also want to make sure I haven't accidentally selected any other parts of the body. Alright, so once again I'm going to right click on surfaces, create from selected, call it hands, clear the selection. finally, I'll do the same thing with the feet. We'll exclude the toenails. Might also bring the feet up a little bit, maybe to around here. Alright, create another surface for that. And I think that's all I'm going to do. Normally, I suspect you would get a lot more granular. From what I've seen, they would typically separate left from right, so left arm, right arm, same with legs, etc. You might also separate lower arm from upper arm, and same with the legs, lower and upper. I'm going to leave it at this for now. We can always come back and refine it if we need to, but I don't want to get too complicated too fast, so we'll leave it at that. Going to save. Now we do need to export the character again, but before we do that, decided I want to add at least 2 more frames to our ROM for now. We will obviously come back and add a lot more customization options, but for now, like I say, I want to add another 2 frames. So I'm going to increase the total to 670. Zoom in towards the end of the timeline. You'll remember we had a shorter pose already. I think I want to have a taller variant as well, just to keep with the theme that we currently have going with the sliders in our widget. So you'll be able to slide between shorter or taller. So this last frame was our arms offset. So I'm actually going to move that a frame along. You don't have to do this actually, the order doesn't matter. I'm just OCD and I want to do it that way really. So I'm going to grab this arm offset frame. Also, highly recommend to get Keymate if you don't have it already. It makes dealing with keyframes in Daz more bearable than dealing with the timeline directly, I find. Anyway, so I'm going to bump the arms offset pose along 1 frame. Now I need to make sure that is zeroed out on the frame before it. So 0 it there, 0 it there. So we have our shorter pose, which is using, I think it was called proportion height. Yep. So on our taller pose, I'm going to set that to positive 50. I'm not going to go to 100 because I don't really want giants. 50 is tall enough. And then I need to make sure that that is not drifting, which it doesn't appear to be. And finally, we have our arms offset pose. I think I also want a leg offset, which I think we decided was necessary when our heavy morph was applied and the character was walking, for example. The thighs were clipping with each other. So on the last frame, I also need to zero out our arm offset, so we'll bring them back down. And we'll create a leg offset of, say, I don't know, 20 is probably going to be enough. Probably more than we need, but we can adjust how much we're applying in Unreal. Make sure that's zeroed out on the frame before it. Okay, so we have our shorter pose, taller, arm offset, leg offset. Finally, I'm just going to select all the keyframes and make sure they're all set to linear interpolation, just so there's no drifting of values in between keyframes. scrub through just to check everything looks alright. So that will be our current new ROM. I'm going to save. Now I do need to export again, so just like we did before, export as animation, sub D1, and export the alembic. Make sure you check the end frame. It won't update automatically, so we've added 2 frames to our ROM. Basically we want this end frame to match this end frame, so we'll just increase that and export. Alright, we'll save that. I won't close Daz just yet because we are going to want to export a skeleton reference for our taller pose. Before I do that, let's copy across what we have. So I can delete, this is our characters working directory, I can delete these files. I'm going to keep our previous skeleton references because we can reuse those, they're still valid. I'll copy across these, or move them rather. Copy our alembic. And now I will export the reference pose for this tall preset. So I'm going to memorize it. Come to frame 0 and restore it. Wait ages while Daz does its thing. Okay, so frame 0 now has our tall preset. Export that as just a skeletal mesh. Alright, now we can close Daz, and I'm not going to save because I don't want to override our ROM with this tall pose on frame 0. So this file here will be our base taller reference skeleton. Don't need any of those. We can now jump into Houdini. Open our project. First thing I'm going to do is come to the import node and just refresh, and that will update the timeline and do a few other things just to make sure it's all in sync with the new files. Then I can come to our skin node, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where we do the, I guess, carving up of our character by defining the skin shapes that we want and what goes along with each shape. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename it to head, get rid of that, and I can automatically select the eyes, mouth and the tear line as belonging to our head. And if I isolate our new head shape by looking at the name attribute, you can see what's currently in it. You obviously want to add the head itself, so under material name I can select head. I also want to add the mouth cavity, which in Daz Genesis 9 at least belongs to the head texture. So I think this will be everything for our head module on our character, our head slot. Next I'm going to create a new one called, I'm not going to call it body, I'll call it torso. I'll select our body, clear that isolation and have a look at our torso group. So we obviously want to add the nipples, which is body 1, and the navel, which is body 2. I think that's all that will go in our body slot. Now I'll do legs. Now we'll just add the legs in it, that's an easy one. Actually, I missed the pelvis, sorry, so we'll do pelvis next. Get rid of that. Add our pelvis. then legs, then our feet. So they'll have our feet, but also our toenails. Then we'll do arms, which will just have our arms. And finally, our hands, which will have our hands and our fingernails. I think that's everything. We can check again if we come up to this isolate field. We shouldn't see anything unusual under this name attribute. We have the slots that we defined. We could also drop down something like a exploded view and connect it up. Another way of looking at how we're going to modularize this character. Alright, we don't need to update anything on the skeleton. It's all still as it was before. Materials we will need to do a little bit of work on. So on the material node, if I again look at the isolate field, you can see we have some unassigned materials now. So we just need to tidy those up. So, and remember that the materials work independently of our modules. So we can have multiple materials on the head part of our character. Same for the rest of them, so they are independent. So let me just work through this logically. We need to add the pelvis to our body because it shares the body material. In fact, so do the hands and feet as well. They all get assigned the body material because remember I set this up for a texture atlas where the body, arms and legs would all share a single texture, so they all need to belong to the body. Feet and hands, what am I missing? Okay, so now I can isolate by the body material as opposed to any of our skin shapes. And it should have pretty much our entire body minus the head and the nails, which it does. And there's no remaining unassigned materials. I'm also going to tick this exclude character name from material names, just because we are going for a modular setup now. I don't really want prototype in all the material names. Just going to keep it generic so that when we do add clothing, if the clothing requires a body material, it will just look for the body material in Unreal Engine. It won't be prefixed with, you know, outfit 1 or outfit 2 or whatever. Hopefully it'll make more sense in a little bit. Also just want to check our UVs before we move on. Bring up the UV viewport and isolate our body. So you can see we all need to do a few things. Because we do now have more shapes than were previously defined. Basically I want to, in the top left, include the pelvis, and the arms I want to include the hands, and the legs I want to include the feet, and we're back to what we had from a UV perspective. Everything else should be fine. We won't touch any of those for now. On the pose asset node, we will need to add the 2 new poses that we added. So I come down to the bottom of the full body poses. I need to add a taller pose in between the short pose and the arm offset, so I can click this button here to add one above. This will be 667. This will be 668. This will be called taller. And the last one, which will be 669, which should align with our end frame, which it does, will be called leg offset. And we need to remember to add our reference skeleton for taller. Should be this one. Leg offset, arm offset, taller, shorter. Okay, save. I think that's everything. We will re-export. We have to re-export. There's no way around that. However, now, because we're going for a modular character setup, under the export options for character, I'm going to tick export separate files for each shape. And we'll do just that. We'll get a separate FBX file for each of our characters' body parts. I don't need the physics animation again. We will unfortunately need to re-import the full body morph pose asset because we've added to it, but that's pretty painless. So I will keep pose asset names. I don't need the drivers, and I don't need the skeleton curves. I don't think. I'll export them just in case. Better to have them and not need them. So I think we're right. So with that, we'll re-export and I'll be back at the end of it. Alright, that's finished exporting. So we can have a look at the files that get exported out. We have a lot more of them. In addition to all the ones we had before, we have now separate FBXs for all of our body parts. We still have the old one that was the complete body, and our pose asset names and various other things. We also have a pose asset name per FBX shape. We shouldn't need all of these. If what I understand is right, we only need to import one of these, but we'll see. So we can now close Houdini, jump into Unreal Engine and keep going. Alright, we are in Unreal Engine. Hopefully more or less where we left off in part 3. This is the complete character. This is in our modularized one, and we have a few sliders to play with, and our 2 camera presets. We hadn't yet solved the focus issue because I, as I say, undid everything I did in the previous part 4, where I did solve that, so we'll go through that again at some stage. Alright, let's get started modularizing our character. So to start with, I'm going to import each of our parts. Let's start with the head, just make sure that goes smoothly, and then I'll probably do the rest all at the same time. Import options should be the same as before. We want morph targets, we don't want animation. We want to make sure it's going onto our prototype skeleton. So I'll import the head. So the head's finished importing. You might notice we have this warning, I guess it is. We can ignore that. The The reason we're getting that is because we have a bone on the skeleton called head, and we have a shape called head, will be also called head, so we're getting this clash node. It's renamed the shape, it hasn't renamed the bone. I don't care about the shape name. As far as I know, it doesn't appear anywhere, it doesn't seem to matter. So I'm going to safely ignore that. It hasn't picked up our materials because if you recall, we removed the character's name from the material slot name. So before I import the rest of them, I'm going to rename those materials. Just remove the prototype from the material name. Just assign these materials since it wasn't able to auto assign them. What am I doing? Head, eyes, tear, occlusion, and the mouth. Alright. Now I'm going to attempt to import all of the others at the same time. Cross my fingers. This might take a while. Alright, that seemed to go smoothly. It's picked up our materials, which is good. So let's go to our character's blueprint. I'm just going to delete the existing skeletal mesh. Going to add a new one. This one's going to be our head. Under the head, I'm going to add a bunch of others. One for the torso, pelvis, legs, feet, oops. Arms and hands. Assign our parts, so we have head, also okay. Now going to come off the event begin play. You remember before we were just simply assigning our animation blueprint directly to the head. I'm going to do it in code, I think, now. So drag off our head, search for blueprint. I want to set anim instance class. Class will be our animation blueprint. going to grab all of the other bits and set leader pose. The leader will be our head. And we won't have any animation because that was assigned directly to our skeletal mesh before, but our morphs are working. You can see there is a slight seam where I thought it might end up around the belly. Not entirely sure what I'm going to do about that yet. If you have any tips, please let me know. I do have one idea, but I haven't tried it yet. Let's hook up the animation again. So if we come into our animation blueprint, for now we'll just hook up our Daz idle animation. So at this point we are back to where we ended in part 3. However, we now have a modular character ready to start assigning some clothes to. So I might call it a part there. It's frustrating that it feels like we haven't made much progress, but we have in a way. We have a now starting point to add some clothes to. In the next part we will do just that. We'll add a couple of simple bits of clothing just as a starting point before we move on. And after that I think we really want to try and finalize our ROM, because the more we add, it's going to be more difficult to change the ROM. So the more clothing we add, it's going to be more time consuming to update the ROM, because really each outfit needs to be processed to have all the right morphs and things based off of that ROM. So I think finalizing our ROM, even though it might not be particularly complicated for this devlog, it will hopefully give you the idea of how I was planning for it all to work. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part. Bye.